Archangel 7, what is your status? Acknowledge. Over. The voice crackled, thin and stretched by distance and desperation. Static was the only reply. Below, the valley floor was a pit of absolute black. Sergeant Miles Atlas Kane adjusted the gain on his night vision, but the darkness swallowed everything. Nothing. No heat signatures from friendlies, no engine glow from the sky. Just the chilling wind whispering through jagged rocks. Command, this is Hammer 1. We have 0 visual on air support. Repeat, the sky is empty. His own breath was a ragged counterpoint to the silence. He tasted dust and fear. A younger SEAL next to him, barely more than a kid, muttered into his radio, "Where the hell are they?" Suddenly a voice, calm and impossibly clear, cut through the noise. "Hammer 1, this is Nighthawk 2, on station. What do you need?" Atlas froze. He did not recognize the call sign. He looked up, scanning the impenetrable void. The sky was still a vacant, starless canvas, but the voice was real. "Nighthawk 2. Who is this?" he transmitted back, his throat tight. The reply came without hesitation, a steady rhythm against the chaos. The backup. 48 hours earlier. Bagram Airfield. The briefing room at Bagram Airfield was a space bleached of warmth and color. Gray walls, gray tables, and the grim gray faces of men who had spent too long staring at maps that promised little more than shades of brown and beige. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and the low hum of a tired air conditioning unit. Captain Anya Petrova sat slightly apart from the main cluster of pilots, a familiar position for her. She was a ghost at the edge of their vision, present but not truly seen. Major Jensen, call sign Viper 1, stood before the projector screen, his posture radiating the easy confidence of a man who had never been second choice for anything in his life. He was a good pilot, arguably one of the best A-10 drivers in the theater, and he knew it. His voice filled the room, authoritative and smooth, as he outlined the particulars of Operation Serpent's Tooth. It was a standard close air support mission. A SEAL team, Hammer 1, was tasked with infiltrating a high-altitude village to capture a high-value target. Jensen's flight would provide top cover, sanitizing the area before insertion and remaining on station for extraction. "Intel suggests a single man-pads threat here," Jensen said, tapping a red circle on the satellite image. "We'll ingress low from the south, using the terrain to mask our approach. Standard procedure." Anya leaned forward slightly, her eyes tracing the topographical lines on her own tablet. The satellite data was recent, but something felt wrong. The southern ridge cast a deep shadow, a long, dark slash across the valley. It was the kind of shadow that could hide things, a geological anomaly, perhaps, or something more deliberate. She made a small note in the margin of her digital map, a quiet question mark. She had learned early in her career that speaking up out of turn was a gamble. As one of the few women flying the Warthog, she walked a perpetual tightrope. Too quiet, and she was invisible. Too assertive, and she was challenging, difficult. She chose her moments with the precision of a surgeon, but this room, dominated by Jensen's effortless command, never seemed to offer the right one. "Anything to add, Petrova?" A voice cut in. It was Captain Davis, Jensen's wingman. The question was not an invitation. It was a test, coated in a thin layer of condescension. Anya looked up, meeting his gaze. "The shadow on the southern ridge," she began, her voice even. "The thermal overlay shows it as consistently cooler than the surrounding rock, even at midday. It could be a cave system, or a deep overhang. It is large enough to conceal a second launch team. Jensen glanced at the screen, then back at her. It was not a dismissive look, but it was brief. "It's a shadow, Captain. The intel guys have cleared this. We stick to the plan. Low ingress, neutralize the primary threat, support the team." He turned back to the map, the conversation effectively over. The other pilots shifted in their seats, their attention snapping back to him. The ghost at the edge of their vision had spoken and was now expected to fade back into silence. Anya did not push. She simply drew a second, smaller red circle on her own map, right in the heart of the shadow. She felt the familiar sting of being overlooked, a quiet frustration that had become a constant, low-grade hum in the background of her life. She was Nighthawk 2, the backup, the spare part in a well-oiled machine. Her job was to be ready in case the primary failed. It was a role defined by absence, by the success of others. The briefing concluded. The men filed out, their conversation a low rumble of technical jargon and inside jokes. Anya remained seated for a moment, the projected map of the desolate Afghan mountains bathing her in a cold, blue light. Her finger traced the line of the southern ridge on her tablet. The feeling of unease did not subside. It settled deeper, a cold premonition in the pit of her stomach. She was just the backup, a silent observer. But sometimes, the observer was the only one who saw the whole picture. And in the silent, shadowed corners of the map, she saw a danger that everyone else had already decided was not there. The A-10C2 simulator was a claustrophobic metal womb, a perfect replica of the cockpit that smelled of worn leather and ozone. It promised the visceral thrill of flight without the risk, a place where mistakes were learning opportunities, not eulogies. For Anya, however, it often felt like another stage where her performance was measured against an impossible standard. Today, that standard was sitting in the instructor's chair behind her, a palpable presence in the small space. Major Jensen. "All right. Nighthawk 2. Jensen's voice was calm and professional, filtered through the headset's intercom. "Scenario is hot. You have a friendly unit pinned down by mortar fire. Grid coordinate 397812. Visual is obscured by smoke. Talk me through your approach." Anya's hands moved with practiced economy over the controls. She brought the simulated Warthog into a gentle, descending orbit around the target area, her eyes scanning the array of screens that substituted for the world outside. The head-up display glowed green, projecting critical data onto her view of the pixelated landscape. "Establishing orbit at Angel 10, she reported, her voice steady. "I am cycling through sensor feeds to get a positive ID on the mortar team. The smoke is making FLIR unreliable. Switching to synthetic aperture radar to map the terrain and isolate the source of the fire. Good," Jensen said. The word was neutral, an acknowledgement, not praise. "But you are losing altitude faster than necessary. A steeper bank angle would keep you higher for longer, giving you a better energy state if you need to evade." Anya made a minute adjustment, leveling the aircraft slightly. The correction was valid, but it was also a matter of preference. His preference. She felt a familiar tightening in her chest. He was not just observing, he was flying the plane through her, his instincts overriding hers, before she even had a chance to fully execute them. The simulator pitched as a simulated surface-to-air missile launched from a hidden position. A shrill alarm blared in her ears. "Missile launch! 4 o'clock low!" she called out, instinct taking over. She slammed the throttle forward, broke hard left, and dumped a cloud of digital flares. The maneuver was textbook, perfectly executed. "Clean dodge," Jensen commented, Now where did that come from? Anya was already working the problem. The launch was not from the primary threat area discussed in the morning's briefing. It was from the south, from the ridge, from the exact area her intuition had flagged. A cold knot formed in her stomach. The launch originated from the southern ridgeline, Major. It looks like my concern about a secondary position was... Focus on the primary objective, Captain. Jensen cut her off smoothly. The mortar team. The missile was a distraction. Neutralize the immediate threat to the ground team. She bit back a retort. He was right, of course. The men on the ground were the priority, but ignoring the second threat was a tactical error. In a real engagement, that missile would have been followed by another. She complied, re-engaging her search for the mortar. She found it moments later, a heat signature blooming and fading in a small clearing. Tally target. I have PID. Rolling in for a gun run, east to west. She nosed the aircraft down, the ground rushing up to meet her. The iconic crosshairs of the GAU-8 Avengers cannon appeared on her HUD, and she laid them over the target. As she prepared to fire, a second missile warning screamed. This one was closer, faster. The textbook evasion would not work. She was too low, too committed to the attack. Without a second's hesitation, she did something unconventional. Instead of breaking away, she pushed the nose down even further, accelerating toward the valley floor. She flew directly into the smoke from the mortar fire, using the thick gray cloud as a screen. The missile, a heat seeker, lost its lock in the thermal chaos. Just as the simulator's ground proximity alarm began its frantic wail, she pulled back hard on the stick, using the immense power of the twin engines to climb almost vertically out of the smoke, spitting flares as she went. The missile detonated harmlessly below her. For a long moment, the only sound in the cockpit was her own breathing. That was creative, Jensen said finally. There was a note of genuine surprise in his voice. You used the environmental conditions to break the lock. I have not seen that before. A flicker of pride warmed Anya's chest. It was the opening she had been waiting for, the moment of recognition. But then he continued, his tone shifting back to that of the instructor. It was also incredibly risky. A few feet lower, and you would have been a crater. In a real-world scenario, stick to the procedure. Predictability keeps you alive. And just like that, the warmth vanished, replaced by a familiar, chilling resignation. He had seen her skill, acknowledged her ingenuity, and then neatly packed it away in a box labeled unnecessary risk. He had praised the technique, but dismissed the instinct behind it. She had not broken the rules, she had written a new one, and he had gently erased it. She completed the rest of the simulation flawlessly, a study in detached perfection. She destroyed the mortar team and the secondary SAM site, following every procedure to the letter. When the simulation ended and the lights in the cockpit came up, she felt nothing but a profound exhaustion. Jensen gave her a satisfied nod as she unstrapped herself. Good work today, Captain. You are a fine backup. He meant it as a compliment. But all Anya heard was the finality of the label. She was not a pilot. She was a backup pilot, a spare, a contingency. She had just pulled off the impossible, and all it had earned her was a confirmation of her place in his shadow. The flight line was a symphony of controlled chaos. The thin, high-altitude air vibrated with the whine of auxiliary power units and the deep-throated roar of F-16 taking off from the main runway. Armored vehicles rumbled past, and crews of ground personnel in sand-colored fatigues moved with a purposeful urgency, their movements a well-rehearsed ballet around the monolithic gray shapes of the aircraft. For Anya, in her role as the backup pilot for Operation Serpent's Tooth. The hours before the mission were a peculiar blend of intense focus and profound stillness. Her own A-10, call sign Nighthawk 2, was fully armed and fueled, parked at the edge of the ready line. She had completed her pre-flight checks an hour ago, walking the perimeter of the formidable aircraft, her gloved hands tracing the lines of its rugged fuselage. She had inspected the ordnance hanging from the hardpoints, Maverick missiles, rocket pods, and the heavy, menacing bulk of the GAU-8 Avenger's ammunition drum. The plane was ready. Her job now was simply to wait, to be the contingency that everyone hoped would not be needed. From her vantage point, she watched as Jensen's ground crew swarmed around his aircraft, Viper 1. He was already in the cockpit, going through his final systems checks. Even from a distance, his presence was unmistakable. He was the center of the operation's gravity, the man everyone was counting on. Anya tracked the familiar routine, her mind running through the mission parameters in parallel, staying mentally engaged. She knew the flight plan, the enemy threat assessments, the rules of engagement. If the call came, she had to be as ready as he was. A dust devil, a miniature cyclone of sand and grit, spun across the tarmac, a harbinger of the worsening weather forecasters had predicted. The sky to the west was taking on a bruised, yellowish hue. The wind was picking up, tugging at the flag on the command tower. She glanced at her watch. Launch window was in 20 minutes. The SEALs would already be moving toward their insertion point, trusting that the sky above them would soon be guarded. That was when the ordered symphony of the flight line shattered into discord. A heavy-duty K-loader, a vehicle used for transporting munitions, was making its way toward the C-130 parking area. Its path was meant to keep it well clear of the active A-10s. But then it faltered. A puff of black smoke erupted from its engine, and the vehicle veered sharply, its brakes squealing uselessly against the momentum of its heavy load. For a horrifying second, it seemed to be heading directly for Anya's plane. She tensed, her body bracing for an impact that never came. At the last moment, the driver managed to wrench the wheel, swerving the vehicle away from her. But his desperate correction sent the loader skidding in a wide, uncontrolled arc directly toward Jensen's aircraft. Time seemed to slow down. Anya saw the ground crew diving for cover. She saw the loader's massive frame slam into a mobile generator cart parked near Jensen's A-10. The cart, made of solid steel, was thrown sideways like a child's toy. It cartwheeled through the air and smashed into the Warthog's left wing, just below the cockpit. The sound was a sickening crunch of metal on metal, a violent percussive blast that cut through the engine noise. Then, silence, broken only by shouting and the sudden, piercing wail of the base's emergency sirens. Anya was already out of her Jeep and running before she consciously made the decision to move. Medics and fire crews were converging on the scene. She pushed through the small crowd that was forming, her heart hammering against her ribs. The loader was a wreck, its driver slumped over the wheel. But her eyes were fixed on Jensen's plane. The wing was mangled, and the cockpit canopy was spider-webbed with cracks. They were helping Jensen out of the cockpit when she arrived. He was on his feet, but leaning heavily on two crew chiefs. His left arm was held at an unnatural angle, and a dark stain was spreading across the sleeve of his flight suit. His face was pale, a mask of shock and frustrated disbelief. His eyes found Anya's through the swirling dust and confusion. In that brief, silent exchange, 1,000 things passed between them. His disappointment, his pain, and something else, something she had never seen in his eyes before, a flicker of desperate reliance. The mission was compromised. The SEALs were in the wind, and he could not fly. A squadron officer pushed through the chaos, his face grim. He barely glanced at the wreckage before his eyes locked onto Anya. "He is down," the officer stated, his voice flat and strained. "The mission is still a go." He did not need to say the rest. The unspoken words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of responsibility. "You are the backup. You are up." Anya looked from Jensen's pained face to her own waiting aircraft, standing untouched and ready. Then she looked to the west, where the sky was no longer just bruised. It was turning a deep, menacing gray. The storm was coming. The Tactical Operations Center felt like the eye of the storm. Inside, the air was cool and still, a stark contrast to the wind howling against the reinforced concrete walls outside. A constellation of screens cast an analytical blue glow on the faces of the command staff, displaying weather patterns, troop movements, and encrypted communications. Every screen told a piece of the same grim story. A sandstorm, designated a haboob, was accelerating across the province. Hammer 1 was moving into hostile territory, and their designated air support was currently grounded, its pilot on his way to the field hospital. Colonel Miller stood before the central map, his back rigid. He was a tall man, with a face that looked as though it had been carved from granite and left out in the sun too long. He listened intently as the weather officer delivered a final, bleak assessment. "Visibility dropping to near zero within the next 30 minutes, Colonel. Wind shear at altitude is extreme. Flight operations are a no-go across the board. I have to recommend we scrub the mission and find a way to pull the team back." Miller's jaw tightened. Pulling them back now is just as dangerous as sending them forward without cover. They are exposed. He turned, his gaze sweeping across the room before landing on Anya. She had followed him from the flight line, her helmet tucked under her arm, her expression calm and resolute. "Captain Petrova." Miller's voice was gravelly, devoid of emotion. "You heard the man. The sky is closed for business." "The sky is not completely closed, sir," Anya stated, stepping forward. She held up her tablet, displaying the same satellite map from the briefing, but now overlaid with real-time weather data. "The main front of the storm is moving along this vector." She drew a thick red arrow on the screen. "But there is a corridor opening up to the north. The mountains are creating a temporary channel, a pocket of clearer air. It will not last long, maybe 60 minutes, but it is there." The weather officer squinted at her screen, then at his own larger display. "It is a high-risk corridor, Captain. The turbulence in that channel will be severe. It is a meat grinder." "The A-10 can handle it," Anya countered, her voice unwavering. "And the approach from the north circumvents the main storm front. It also provides a direct masked ingress to the target area, avoiding the southern ridge entirely." She brought up the notes she had made earlier. "Sir, I believe there is a second SAM site hidden in the shadow of that ridge. An approach from the south, even in clear weather, would have been a trap. This route neutralizes both the weather and the potential ambush." Colonel Miller stared at her, his eyes narrowed. He was caught in an impossible position. The rulebook was screaming at him to stand down, to not risk another billion-dollar aircraft and its pilot on a long shot. Every instinct for self-preservation in his command structure agreed. But the faces of the men in Hammer 1, men he had sent into harm's way, were a powerful counter-argument. He saw not a reckless pilot in front of him, but a prepared officer presenting a calculated, albeit dangerous, solution. She was not asking for permission based on hope. She was providing a plan based on data he had not seen. You would be flying blind through a mountain pass in a sandstorm, with no wingman and no support, Miller said, testing her resolve. You would be entirely on your own. The SEALs are on their own right now, sir, Anya replied quietly. Being on my own is the better of two bad options. The silence in the TOC was absolute. The hum of the servers and the distant moan of the wind were the only sounds. Anya did not look away from the colonel's gaze. For the first time, she was not the backup, not the second choice. She was the only choice. The weight of it did not crush her. It solidified her. The years of being overlooked, of running simulations until her eyes burned, of studying maps long after everyone else had gone home. It had all led to this single moment. She was not just stepping in for Jensen. She was stepping into a role she had been preparing for all along. Miller's expression was unreadable, but after a long, tense moment, he seemed to come to a decision. He gave a sharp, decisive nod. "Get to your aircraft, Captain," he ordered, his voice ringing with renewed authority. He turned to the communications officer. "Get me a line to Hammer 1. Tell them help is on the way. Call sign: Nighthawk 2. Anya did not waste a second. She nodded once to the colonel, a silent acknowledgement of the trust he had just placed in her. Then she turned and walked out of the sterile blue light of the command center and back into the raging wind, toward the lone Warthog waiting for her on the flight line. The runway lights were faint smudges in a sea of blowing sand. As Anya taxied Nighthawk 2 into position, the A-10 felt less like an aircraft and more like an anchor straining against its chain. The crosswind slammed into its broad tail, trying to shove the 10-ton machine off the tarmac. Inside the cockpit, she was sealed in a world of humming electronics and the steady hiss of the oxygen system, but she could feel the storm's fury through the very bones of the airframe. The entire plane shuddered and groaned. "Tower, this is Nighthawk 2, ready for departure," she transmitted, her voice a pocket of calm in the chaos. "Nighthawk 2, you are cleared for takeoff," the voice from the tower came back, tight with strain. "Godspeed, Captain." Anya pushed the twin throttles to their stops. The General Electric engines spooled up with a deep, hungry roar that vibrated through her seat and up her spine. The Warthog surged forward, fighting the wind for every inch of acceleration. Sand scoured the reinforced glass of her canopy, the sound like 1,000 tiny claws trying to rip their way inside. She was flying blind, her trust placed entirely in the glowing green lines of the head-up display and the runway markers she could no longer see. The nose lifted. For a heart-stopping moment, the wind caught the wing and the aircraft skewed violently to the left. Anya's feet danced on the rudder pedals, making dozens of micro-corrections, wrestling the plane back into alignment. Then, with a final shuddering lurch, the wheels left the ground. She was airborne, a solitary soul swallowed by an ocean of roiling, angry dust. She retracted the landing gear, and the immediate world outside her cockpit vanished completely. There was no up, no down, no horizon, only an oppressive, featureless brown. She was flying purely on instruments, her life dependent on the gyroscopes and digital readouts that painted a picture of a world she could not see. The plane was bucking like a wild animal, thrown about by vicious pockets of turbulence. Red and yellow caution lights flickered on her master warning panel as the engines ingested sand and the flight computer struggled to make sense of the erratic airflow. The terrain awareness and warning system became a nagging voice in her ear. Terrain. Terrain. Pull up. Stow it, she muttered, silencing the automated warning. She knew where the mountains were. Her flight path through the northern channel was a razor's edge, a tight corridor she had memorized from the maps. She had to stay low enough to avoid the worst of the wind shear at higher altitudes, but high enough to clear the unseen peaks that flanked her on both sides. For what felt like an eternity, she fought the storm. Her body was strapped tight, but her muscles ached with the strain of constant, jarring corrections. The sand blasting of the canopy was a maddening, incessant noise. This was the meat grinder the weather officer had warned her about. It was a physical, brutal assault, designed to wear down both machine and pilot. But Anya's focus narrowed until nothing existed but the glowing green data on her HUD altitude, airspeed, heading. These numbers were her reality, her religion. Then, just as the relentless pressure seemed unbearable, she broke through. One moment, she was in the heart of the maelstrom. The next, she punched through the other side of the dust wall and into the corridor of clear air she had gambled on. The turbulence eased instantly. The maddening sound of sand on glass ceased. Below her, the jagged teeth of the mountain range were visible, bathed in the eerie pre-dawn light. Above, the stars were faint but visible through a thin haze. It was a moment of profound, shocking peace. She took a single deep breath, the first she felt she had truly taken since takeoff. She was not a backup. She was not a contingency. She was a pilot, alone in the sky, flying a machine built for war into the heart of a storm. And she was winning. The feeling was not one of arrogance, but of quiet, steely affirmation. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. The moment of peace was fleeting. Her mission clock was ticking. She nudged the stick forward, pushing her aircraft toward the coordinates where Hammer 1 was fighting for their lives. She keyed her radio, switching to the encrypted tactical frequency. Hammer 1, this is Nighthawk 2. How copy, over? The response was immediate but weak, laced with the crackle of static and the distant pop of gunfire. Solid. Copy, Nighthawk 2. We are taking EV fire. Glad you could ache it. The voice was strained, desperate, but it was there. They were there, and she was here to help. The storm still raged behind her, and a different kind of storm lay ahead. Her flight was over. Her fight was about to begin. Anya pushed the A-10 into a wide, circling orbit over the target coordinates, a silent hunter gliding through the thin, cold air. The chaos of the storm was behind her, but the battlefield below was a different kind of tempest. The valley was a labyrinth of jagged rock formations and deep crevasses, a landscape designed by nature to confound and conceal. Through her, night vision systems. The world was rendered in an ethereal monochrome of green and black, a ghostly tableau of a fight she could hear but not yet clearly see. Her forward-looking infrared FLIR display painted a confusing picture. Heat signatures bloomed and faded across the valley floor. Some were clearly muzzle flashes from automatic weapons, brief, brilliant starbursts of intense heat. Others were more ambiguous, warm rocks, small fires, or the lingering thermal ghosts of explosions. Friend from foe was a distinction that did not exist in this grayscale world. The rules of engagement were absolute on this point. Without positive identification, she could not release her weapons. She was a god with a thunderbolt in her hand, but she was blind. Nighthawk 2! This is Hammer 1! The voice of Sergeant Atlas crackled in her ear, punctuated by the sharp report of his own weapon. Enemy positions are dug in along the western ridge. They have us pinned down in a dry riverbed. We cannot move. Copy, Hammer 1. I am overhead, but I have no clear picture of your position relative to the hostiles. Anya transmitted back, her eyes flicking between her sensor displays. She could see the riverbed, a pale, snaking line on the FLIR, but the heat signatures of the SEALs were masked by the surrounding rock. I need you to mark your position. There was a pause, filled with the sound of labored breathing and muffled shouting. Negative, Nighthawk. We pop an IR strobe and we will draw every RPG in this valley. We are too exposed. Anya's gloved hand tightened on the control stick. He was right. Any overt signal would be a death sentence. They were trapped in a deadly paradox. To be saved, they had to reveal themselves, but to reveal themselves was to be killed. The frustration was a physical thing, a knot of useless power in her gut. She had fought her way through a hurricane only to be stymied by shadows. They are trying to flank us from the north, Atlas reported, his voice tighter now. We cannot hold this position for much longer. Anya banked the A-10, her gaze sweeping over the northern approach to the riverbed. She saw movement, a cluster of warm shapes advancing from cover to cover. It had to be the enemy, but she could not be certain. They were too close to the SEAL's last known position. The risk of friendly fire was immense. A single 30mm cannon shell, straying just a few meters, would be catastrophic. Atlas, I see the flanking element, but I cannot engage, she said, her voice strained with the effort of keeping it level. They are danger close. I repeat, you are danger close. I cannot get a clean shot. Another pause, longer this time. Anya could picture him on the ground, taking cover behind some rock, weighing his dwindling options. The fate of his men rested on the next decision. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. The desperation was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. All right, Nighthawk, new plan. I am going to mark the target for you. Anya frowned. Mark it how? Your strobes are a no-go, not with a strobe. With a laser, Atlas said. We have a SOFLAM. I'm going to paint the primary machine gun nest on the western ridge. It is the one giving us the most trouble. You will see my beam. You will engage where it terminates. Anya's blood ran cold. A laser designator was not a subtle tool. Its beam was invisible to the naked eye. But any enemy with even basic night vision equipment would see him lighted up. He would be pointing a giant, invisible finger straight back to his own position. Atlas, the moment you turn that thing on, they will know exactly where you are. They will focus all fire on your position. That is the point. Atlas replied grimly. It will make them keep their heads down for a few seconds. And a few seconds is all you need, right? It was a plan born of pure desperation, a gamble of incredible risk and absolute trust. He was trusting her to see the beam, lock on, and deliver ordnance with surgical precision in a vanishingly small window of time. He was betting his life and the lives of his men on her skill. It is a risk, Atlas, she said, her professional duty compelling her to state the obvious. It is the only shot we have got, he shot back. Get ready, Nighthawk. I am moving into position. Anya took a deep, steadying breath. This was it. The mission, the lives of these men, had distilled down to this single, terrifying moment of shared faith. She armed the GAU-8 Avenger. The low, heavy hum of the weapon system vibrating through the airframe was a reassuring presence. I am ready, Hammer 1. Send it. Copy, came the reply, strained with effort. Laser on in 5, 4, 3, 2, Anya's eyes were glued to her targeting pod display, her thumb resting on the trigger. The world narrowed to that single screen, to a few square meters of rock on a desolate mountainside, half a world away. The word was a mere whisper of static in Anya's ear, but on her screen, it was a revelation. A tiny, brilliant point of infrared light bloomed on the western ridge, perfectly illuminating a cluster of rocks that she now realized was a fortified machine gun nest. The beam was as steady as a surgeon's hand, a pinpoint of pure intention in the chaotic landscape. Atlas was holding his position. Anya did not hesitate. The moment of decision had already passed, the pact of trust already sealed. Now there was only execution. She rolled the A-10 onto its side and pulled the stick back, nosing the aircraft into a steep, controlled dive. The ground did not rush up to meet her. She fell upon it, a hawk descending on its prey. The world tilted, gravity pushed her deep into her seat, and the green lines of her HUD locked onto the laser's designation. Her thumb stroked the trigger, the first stage of the two-stage firing mechanism. The iconic bar-jour-T of the GAU-8 Avenger was a sound legendary among ground troops, a promise of deliverance. But inside the cockpit, the reality was far more intimate and violent. When she squeezed the trigger, the aircraft did not just fire a weapon. For a brief moment, the entire airframe became the weapon. A deep, bone-jarring vibration seized the plane, a sensation like the world's largest chainsaw tearing through the airframe itself. The smell of cordite and ozone, acrid and sharp, flooded the cockpit even through the advanced filtration system. A torrent of 30mm armor-piercing incendiary rounds, each the size of a milk bottle, spewed from the nose of the aircraft at a staggering rate of 70 rounds per second. On her screen, the point of light that was the enemy nest was erased, replaced by a furious cascade of secondary explosions as the high-explosive shells found their mark. Her dive had made her a target. The darkness below erupted with streaks of red and green light as enemy tracer rounds reached up for her, a frantic, desperate attempt to swat her from the sky. Alarms shrieked in her headset as their primitive radar-guided guns tried to get a lock. "Braking right," she said into her radio, her voice calm, almost detached. It was a statement of fact, not a cry of alarm. She pulled back on the stick, the G-forces squeezing the air from her lungs, and wrenched the A-10 out of its dive, dumping a preemptive cloud of flares to confuse any potential heat-seeking missiles. The tracer fire fell away behind her as she climbed, trading altitude for safety. She circled back, her heart pounding a steady, powerful rhythm against her ribs. The valley below was silent. The relentless chatter of the enemy machine gun had ceased. The silence was heavy, absolute, pregnant with possibility. Had she been accurate enough? Had Atlas survived the torrent of fire his laser had attracted? "Good hit!" "Good hit." The voice was Atlas's, breathless but exultant. "Target destroyed. That was a righteous run, Nighthawk. Righteous." A wave of relief so powerful it almost made her dizzy washed over Anya. He was alive. It had worked. The bond forged between them over the radio, a bond of pure professional trust, solidified into something unbreakable. "I have another target for you," Atlas continued immediately, his voice all business again. He was not celebrating. He was prosecuting the fight. "The flanking element to the north. They are trying to consolidate in a ravine. Can you see it?" Anya was already banking the plane, her sensors sweeping the area he had indicated. The cluster of heat signatures was still there, now static, pinned down by the shock of what had just happened to their comrades. They had thought themselves safe, hidden. They had not counted on the storm breaking, nor on the angel of vengeance it had delivered. "I have them," she confirmed. "Satitsi tally second target." "Hit them," Atlas ordered simply. Anya rolled in for her second pass. This time there was less resistance. The enemy was disorganized, terrified. Her second burst from the Avenger was just as precise as the first, a devastating scythe of depleted uranium and high explosives that turned the ravine into a charnel house. She pulled away again, climbing back into the relative safety of the dark sky, her breathing steady, her movements fluid and economical. She was no longer just a pilot. She and Atlas were a team, a single lethal entity connected by a fragile radio signal, working in perfect, deadly harmony. He was her eyes. She was his sword. One by one, he called out the targets, and one by one, she erased them. Finally, a different kind of silence settled over the valley. It was not the tense quiet of before, but the exhausted quiet of a battle won. "Nighthawk!" Atlas's voice came through, ragged with fatigue but clear. "Hostile fire has ceased. I think you got them all." "We are clear." Anya allowed herself a small internal sigh of relief, but as her eyes swept the instruments, a new warning light blinked on her console. It was a small, amber light. Low fuel. Her fight through the storm and the repeated high-G combat maneuvers had consumed gas at an alarming rate. The battle for the valley was over, but a new one, a battle against time and distance, was just beginning. With the immediate threat neutralized, a fragile sense of calm returned to the valley. Anya throttled back, pulling the A-10 into a higher, more fuel-efficient orbit. Her role had shifted from assault to overwatch. Below, she could see the tiny thermal signatures of Hammer 1 emerging from the dry riverbed, beginning their cautious advance toward the designated extraction zone, a small, flat mesa 2 kilometers to the east. Her job now was to be their guardian angel, a silent presence ensuring their path remained clear. "Nighthawk, we are on the move," Atlas reported. His voice was steady, professional, but she could hear the undercurrent of exhaustion. "Keep your eyes peeled. There is no such thing as an easy walk home. Copy, Hammer 1. I am watching your 6, Anya replied. "You have a clear path so far." The amber low-fuel light on her console was a persistent, unwelcome companion. According to her calculations, she had enough fuel to remain on station until the rescue helicopter arrived, and then make it back to Bagram. But the margins were razor-thin. There was no room for error, no allowance for unexpected detours or afterburner-fueled combat maneuvers. She watched the SEALs move, their discipline evident even in their weary gait. They flowed over the rocky terrain, covering each other, a single, cohesive unit. They were almost there. The promise of safety was a tangible thing, a light at the end of a very dark tunnel. It was a light that was nearly extinguished in an instant. It appeared without warning, a predator using the terrain for cover. A low, rhythmic thump, thump, thump registered on her audio sensors just moments before the aircraft itself crested a nearby ridge. It was a Mi-24 Hind gunship, a flying relic of a bygone war, but no less deadly for its age. Its bulky insectoid shape was unmistakable, designed for one purpose: hunting and killing troops on the ground. It was not looking for her. Its bulbous cockpit was angled downward, its sensors scanning the valley floor for the men it knew must be there. "Atlas, contact! Enemy gunship, north of your position, low altitude!" Anya's voice was sharp, cutting through the quiet radio frequency. She pushed the throttle forward, diving to intercept. On the ground, The SEALs scattered, melting back into the rocks. But there was nowhere to truly hide. The hind was a wolf among sheep, and they were caught in the open. The helicopter pilot saw them. Its nose dipped, and a volley of rockets screamed from its wing-mounted pods, impacting the ground where the SEALs had been moments before. Rock and shrapnel exploded upwards. Anya's mind raced. She had no air-to-air missiles. The A-10 was a mud mover, a ground pounder. In a fight against a nimble gunship in a tight canyon, she was at a severe disadvantage. The hind could hug the terrain, using the rock walls to mask its movement, while her fixed-wing aircraft was forced into wider, more predictable turns. But she had two things the hind did not: thicker armor and the GAU-8 Avenger. She abandoned any notion of a traditional dogfight. Her objective was not to shoot down the helicopter, but to protect the men on the ground. She dove her Warthog directly into the space between the hind and the SEALs. It was an act of pure, audacious aggression. She made her aircraft a shield, a 10-ton wall of titanium and depleted uranium. The hind's pilot was clearly shocked, forced to pull up sharply to avoid a collision. For a moment, the two aircraft were suspended in a tense aerial standoff, predator facing protector. Anya could see the faces in the other cockpit, small figures staring back at her. She sent her message. She did not aim at the helicopter. She aimed in front of it, firing a short, brutally loud burst from the GAU-8. The stream of 30mm tracers acted as a flaming, incandescent barrier, a line drawn in the sky. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, a deafening roar that spoke a universal language of overwhelming firepower. It was not an attack. It was a statement. Come no closer. The hind's pilot got the message. He broke off his attack run, veering away from the terrifying wall of lead she had thrown up. He was a hunter, not a brawler, and he wanted no part of a head-on engagement with the heavily armed A-10. But he was not retreating. Instead, he dropped lower, using a narrow ravine to circle around, looking for another angle of attack. A dangerous cat-and-mouse game began. Anya shadowed the helicopter, staying between him and the SEALs, her movements dictated by his. She could not follow him into the tightest turns, but she could cut him off, using her speed to reposition and block his path. The low fuel light was screaming at her now, a constant, shrill beacon of her own dwindling time. Each burst of the throttle brought her closer to a dead stick landing in enemy territory. "He is heading for the mesa," Atlas yelled over the radio. "He is trying to cut us off from the EZ." Anya saw it too. The hind was making a final, desperate play for the extraction zone. She had only one move left. She dove one last time, placing her aircraft directly in his path. Flying so low, her own rotor wash kicked up dust from the mesa floor. They were closing fast, a game of aerial chicken she could not afford to lose. She armed the cannon again. This time, the hind pilot did not wait to see if she would fire. He broke off, hard, and retreated, a dark shape disappearing back over the northern ridge. He had decided the prey was not worth the price. Anya pulled up, her engines screaming in protest. Below her, the SEAL team was making a final dash, scrambling onto the flat top of the mesa. The extraction zone was secure. In the distance, she could just make out the approaching lights of the CSAR helicopter. Her job, at last, was nearly done. The sky was beginning to bleed with the first hint of dawn, a soft, gray luminescence painting the eastern horizon. Anya held Nighthawk 2 in a wide, lazy orbit, a circling sentinel high above the mesa. Every movement of the controls was deliberate and gentle, designed to conserve the last precious drops of fuel. The amber warning light was no longer just a light. It was a living presence in the cockpit, a constant, silent accusation. Her flight computer calculated her remaining flight time in minutes that were evaporating far too quickly. She was well past bingo fuel, the point at which a pilot should have already turned for home. Below, the rescue operation was underway. A pair of HH-60 Pavehawk helicopters, call sign Pedro 1 and Pedro 2, had arrived on station. Their powerful rotors kicked up clouds of dust as one settled onto the mesa while the other provided close aerial security. The efficiency of the combat search and rescue teams was a thing of beauty. Pararescue men, known as PJs, were already on the ground, securing the perimeter and helping the exhausted SEALs aboard. Anya watched it all unfold on her screens, a distant observer to the final act of a play she had helped write. She saw the thermal signatures of the Hammer 1 team move one by one into the waiting maw of the helicopter. Each successful embarkation was a small victory, another life she had protected. She maintained a vigilant scan of the surrounding ridges, her eyes searching for any sign of a resurgent threat, but the valley remained still and silent. The fight had gone out of it, leaving only the cold rocks and the ghosts of the battle. Her own fight, however, continued. She had reduced engine power to the bare minimum required to stay airborne, turning her aggressive Warthog into a reluctant glider. The silence from the ground team was a good sign. It meant they were focused on getting out. But it was also isolating. The intense life-or-death connection she had shared with Atlas over the radio had been severed, replaced by the impersonal chatter of the rescue crews coordinating their efforts. Finally, the voice she had been waiting for came over the net. It was the pilot of Pedro 1. Nighthawk 2, this is Pedro 1. All Hammer personnel are aboard. We are lifting off, solid copy, Pedro 1. Anya replied, relief washing over her. I will escort you to the edge of the threat area. Appreciate the thought, Nighthawk, but we can take it from here, the pilot said, his voice laced with concern. Your fuel state must be critical. Get yourself home. He was right. Her duty was done. The team was safe. Yet she lingered for a moment, watching as the two Pavehawks lifted gracefully from the mesa, their dark shapes gaining speed as they turned east, toward home. It was then that her radio crackled one last time on the tactical frequency. It was not a pilot. It was Atlas. His voice was different now, no longer strained with the pressure of combat, no longer barking commands. It was quiet, filled with a profound, weary gratitude that seemed to traverse the distance between his helicopter and her cockpit instantly. Nighthawk 2. Anya. He had never used her name before. The sound of it, spoken by this man whose life she had just saved, felt startlingly intimate. We are all aboard, he said simply. We are okay. I see that, Atlas, she replied, her own voice softer than she expected. Glad you made it. There was a pause. She could hear the rhythmic whump of the helicopter blades in the background of his transmission. He was searching for the right words, words that could possibly contain the weight of what had happened in that valley. You know, he began slowly, when that storm hit, Command told us air support was scrubbed. All flights grounded. They told us we were on our own. He paused again. We looked at the sky, and there was nothing. It was just black. The whole damn sky was empty. Anya listened, her hand resting on the throttle, her gaze lost somewhere in the growing light of the new day. And then we heard your voice, he continued, his voice thick with emotion. Just your voice. Out of nowhere. When everyone else was grounded, you came. The entire sky was empty. There was only you. The words landed with the force of a physical impact. There was only you. In that single sentence, Atlas reframed everything. She was not the backup who got lucky. She was not the substitute filling in for the hero. She was the one who flew into the storm when no one else would. In the moment of ultimate crisis, when the sky was void of hope, she had been the solitary light. A lump formed in her throat. All the years of feeling invisible, of fighting for a respect that was always just out of reach, of being the backup, it all melted away in the face of his simple, profound truth. "Get your men home, Sergeant," she managed to say. "Copy that, Captain," he replied. "Thank you." The transmission ended. Anya watched the Pavehawks disappear into the distance. She was alone again, a single aircraft in a vast, empty sky. But for the first time in a very long time, she did not feel like a spare part. She felt essential. She took a final look at the valley below, then banked her A-10 and set a direct course for Bagram. The return flight to Bagram was a long, silent trial. The adrenaline that had sustained Anya through the storm and the firefight had receded, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. Every muscle in her body ached from the strain of fighting the G-forces and the turbulence. Her mind, pushed to its limit for hours, felt frayed and slow. The only thing keeping her sharp was the insistent, blinking amber light of the low fuel warning. It was a race, plain and simple. Her against the laws of physics and aerodynamics. She had already declared an emergency, her voice a flat, professional monotone as she informed Bagram's air traffic control of her fuel state. The response was immediate. They cleared a path for her, diverting all other air traffic. The main runway, runway 03, was hers and hers alone. Emergency vehicles, fire trucks, and ambulances, the so-called crash crew, were already rolling into position, their flashing lights muted by the distance. They were preparing for the worst, a dead-stick landing, a controlled crash with engines starved of fuel. Anya focused on her glide path, her breathing slow and measured. She was too tired to feel fear. All that remained was a core of pure, stubborn professionalism. She had not fought her way through a tempest and stared down a hind gunship only to fail on the final approach. She coaxed the A-10 through the air, treating the controls with a feather-light touch, preserving every bit of momentum. The aircraft felt heavy and sluggish, a wounded beast longing for its lair. The sun was cresting the mountains now, bathing the landscape in a brilliant golden light. It was a beautiful, peaceful morning, a world away from the violent darkness she had just left behind. As she lined up for her final approach, she could see the entire base laid out before her, and she saw something else. Along the edge of the taxiway, near the A-10 parking revetments, figures were gathering. Ground crews, off-duty pilots, support staff. They were not running to their stations. They were standing and watching. Waiting. She lowered the landing gear, the familiar clunk and hiss of the hydraulics a welcome sound. The runway stretched out in front of her, a long, dark ribbon of asphalt. Her approach was perfect, her airspeed bleeding off exactly as it should. The plane descended, smooth and steady. Just as she flared for the landing, a final shrill alarm blared in the cockpit. The engines were flaming out. The tanks were dry. For the last few hundred feet, she was a glider pilot. The wheels touched the tarmac with a gentle chirp, a kiss of rubber on asphalt that was impossibly soft. The plane rolled down the center line, its momentum carrying it forward. She deployed the speed brakes, letting the aircraft coast to a slow, natural stop long before it reached the end of the runway. She had made it. The silence in the cockpit was absolute. The roar of the engines, the hiss of the oxygen, the shriek of the alarms, all gone. All that remained was the sound of her own breathing and the frantic, relieved beating of her heart. She rested her forehead against the cool glass of the canopy for a long moment, simply allowing the exhaustion to wash over her. Then, a voice crackled in her headset, cutting through the profound quiet. It was not the air traffic controller. It was Colonel Miller. "Welcome home, Nighthawk 2, he said, his gravelly voice filled with a warmth she had never heard before. "Well done, Captain." Well done, the formal address, the simple words of praise from the stone-faced commander, meant more than any medal. It was an acknowledgement, a validation. Anya took a slow breath and keyed her microphone, her own voice hoarse with fatigue. "Nighthawk 2 is on the ground," she replied. "Good to be back, sir." The ground crews were already approaching, but they kept a respectful distance as a tow tractor was brought in to pull the inert aircraft off the runway. As she went through the final steps of the shutdown procedure, powering down the avionics and making the cockpit safe, she finally looked again at the crowd that had gathered. They were still there, a silent assembly. They were not cheering or clapping. They were simply bearing witness. As the canopy retracted, letting in the cool morning air and the smell of desert rain on hot asphalt, Anya knew that something fundamental had changed. She had left this base as a backup. She was returning as something else entirely. Anya descended the metal ladder from the cockpit, her legs feeling unsteady after hours locked onto the rudder pedals. When her boots hit the tarmac, the silence of the assembled crowd seemed to grow even heavier. All eyes were on her. There was no applause. There were no cheers. There was only a collective, watchful stillness, an atmosphere thick with unspoken sentiment. She could feel the gaze of dozens of people on her, analyzing, weighing. The ground crew chief, a grizzled master sergeant with oil etched into the lines of his hands and a face weathered by the desert sun, was the first to approach. He said nothing, walking past her directly to the aircraft, his hand running lightly over the metal skin. The nose and wing edges were scoured, the gray paint blasted away in patches by the sand, revealing the bare metal beneath. There were several small punctures, the marks of anti-aircraft shrapnel. The plane looked tired, battered, much like its pilot. After completing his quick inspection, the sergeant turned back, his eyes meeting Anya's. He gave a single, short, decisive nod. It was not praise. It was a professional acknowledgement. "You brought my bird home." For a man who had spent his life tending to these machines, it was the highest form of respect. Anya returned the nod, then began the long, solitary walk across the parking apron toward the debriefing area. The crowd of pilots and ground personnel was still there, a silent wall of people. She braced herself for the questions. She had violated flight safety rules, pushed an expensive asset to its breaking point. She was ready to defend her decisions. But no questions came. As she approached, the wall of people broke. Like a quiet, parting sea, they made way for her to pass. No one touched her. Most avoided her gaze, but as she walked by, she saw the nods. Captain Davis, the one who had challenged her in the briefing, looked down at the ground. Others, pilots she had flown with in training scenarios, simply watched her pass in silence. Their quiet was not indifference or judgment. It was awe. It was respect. In their world, a world of measured actions and spare words, this silence was more eloquent than any speech. They, more than anyone, understood what she had done. They knew the ferocity of that storm. They knew the insanity of flying alone, unsupported, into a valley thick with enemy fire. They did not need to say it. They just needed to look at the battered aircraft and the exhausted woman who had flown it back. Anya realized then that the recognition she had always craved did not come in the form of loud accolades. It came as a path cleared in silence, a space created by deference. She was no longer the outsider, the ghost at the edge of the briefing room. She had flown through the storm and returned, and in the process, she had carved out her own place in the very center of this respectful quiet. She did not stop. She kept walking, her back straight, though every step was a monumental effort. She passed through the hangar, the air cool and still, smelling of jet fuel and metal. Her next stop, by regulation, was the infirmary for a post-mission medical check. The door to the infirmary swung open with a soft hiss. The light inside was white and stark, and the first person she saw was Major Jensen. He was sitting on an examination bed, his left arm bound in a cast and supported by a sling. He would have been told. Of course. News on an airbase travels faster than fire. He looked up as she entered. Their eyes met, and for the first time, Anya did not see the look of an instructor regarding his student, or a flight lead regarding his subordinate. She saw something entirely different, something she never thought she would see in his eyes. She saw respect. The infirmary was a sterile, quiet space, smelling sharply of antiseptic and clean linen. The harsh fluorescent lights hummed overhead, erasing all shadows. For a long moment, neither Anya nor Jensen spoke. The silence was different from the one on the flight line. This one was personal, filled with the weight of everything that had happened since they had last seen each other. Anya stood, her exhaustion a heavy cloak on her shoulders, while Jensen sat on the edge of the examination bed, his good hand resting on his knee. A medic bustled in, took Anya's vitals with practiced efficiency, and asked her a series of standard post-flight questions, his voice a low drone in the quiet room. She answered automatically, her mind elsewhere. When the medic finished and left them alone again, Jensen finally broke the silence. "The BDA report just came in," he said, his voice low. He did not look at her, instead staring at the polished linoleum floor. "They found shrapnel from 3 separate AAA rounds in your port engine cowling, and another one tore through the vertical stabilizer. A few inches to the left, and it would have severed your hydraulic lines." Anya simply nodded, absorbing the information. She had known she was hit. She had felt the impacts. But hearing the clinical assessment made it real in a way it had not been before. "You flew it back with one engine half shredded and no fuel," Jensen continued, still not looking up. "That was a hell of a piece of flying." "I just did what needed to be done," she said, the words feeling inadequate. Jensen finally lifted his head, and his eyes met hers. The look of respect was still there, but now it was joined by something else, something that looked like regret. "No," he said quietly. "You did what I should have done. In the briefing, you pointed out the southern ridge. You saw the shadow. I dismissed it." He took a breath. "Intel confirmed it this morning. They found the remains of a ZU-23 emplacement right where you said it would be. The launch you evaded in the simulator, it would have been real. My flight plan would have flown me and my wingman straight into a kill box. The admission hung in the air between them. It was a confession, a stripping away of the easy confidence and authority he always wore. He was admitting not just a tactical error, but a failure of listening. "You were right," he said. The words were simple, unadorned, and carried more weight than 1,000 compliments. He reached into the pocket of his undirtied flight suit with his good hand and pulled something out. It was a small, circular patch, intricately embroidered. It was not a standard-issue squadron patch. It was an unofficial one, the kind pilots trade among themselves, a symbol of a shared, unrecordable experience. This one depicted an A-10 flying through a storm cloud, with a single bolt of lightning striking the ground below it. "Every pilot has a flight that defines them," Jensen said, holding the patch out to her. "The one that tests you to the absolute limit. This was yours." He placed it in her hand. "This is yours. You earned it." Anya looked down at the patch. The threads were rough beneath her fingertips. This was not a medal to be pinned on a uniform in a formal ceremony. This was something more. It was a key, an invitation into an inner circle she had always been on the outside of. It was not a gift from a superior officer. It was a tribute from a fellow pilot. She closed her hand around it, the small token a solid, real presence. The last vestiges of her self-doubt, the quiet, nagging voice that had told her for years that she was just a backup, finally fell silent. "Thank you, Major," she said, her voice steady. "Call me Jake," he replied, a faint, weary smile touching his lips for the first time. "I think you have earned that too." An unspoken understanding passed between them. The hierarchy had dissolved, replaced by a new, level foundation of mutual respect. The path ahead for her in the squadron would be different now. But as she stood there, the small patch clutched in her hand, she knew the official story of Operation Serpent's Tooth. The reports and the commendations had yet to be written, and she had no idea what it would say. 2 days later, the members of Hammer 1 returned to Bagram. They arrived unceremoniously, as special operations teams often do, reappearing from the shadowy world of their work with little fanfare. They spent the first several hours in mandatory debriefings with intelligence officers and post-mission medical evaluations. Anya knew they were back on base, and the knowledge created a strange sense of anxiety in her. She felt an odd reluctance to see them face to face. In the air, she was Nighthawk 2, a call sign, a disembodied voice delivering ordnance from an untouchable distance. On the ground, she was just Anya Petrova, a captain who felt more comfortable with the complex language of avionics than with the uncertain terrain of human gratitude. She had done her job. They had done theirs. In her mind, the transaction was complete. She feared a meeting would complicate that simple, clean equation with emotions she was not prepared to process. She was in the squadron's common room, nursing a cup of coffee and reviewing flight data from her mission, when the door opened. Sergeant Atlas stepped inside, followed by the rest of his team. They were out of their combat gear, dressed in simple tan t-shirts and cargo pants, but they carried the weight of the valley with them. It was in the weary set of their shoulders, the haunted look in their eyes, and the fine layer of ineradicable dust that seemed to be ground into their very skin. The idle chatter in the room died down. The other pilots looked up from their magazines and laptops. The SEALs were residents of a different, harsher world, and their presence shifted the atmosphere in the room. They scanned the faces, and their eyes settled on Anya. Atlas moved first. He walked directly toward her, his footsteps silent on the worn floor. Anya stood up, her heart rate quickening slightly. He was taller than she had imagined, with a lean, wiry strength. His face was weathered, his eyes a startlingly clear blue. He stopped in front of her. He did not salute. Instead, he simply extended a hand. "Atlas," he said, his voice the same calm, steady presence she remembered from the radio. "Though I guess my mother calls me Miles." Anya took his hand. His grip was firm, calloused, and strong. "Anya Petrova," she replied. "We know," another SEAL said from behind him, a small, wry smile on his face. The rest of the team nodded in agreement. "We, wanted to come by," Atlas continued, a hint of awkwardness in his manner now that they were face to face. "To say thanks. What you did up there, well, the debriefing reports won't do it justice." "I was just doing my job, Sergeant," Anya said, falling back on the familiar, safe script. Atlas's smile was knowing. He seemed to understand her discomfort perfectly. "Maybe," he said, his voice dropping lower so only she could hear. "But I have been in this line of work a long time, Captain. I know the difference between someone doing their job and someone doing the impossible because it is the right thing to do. They told us on the radio that the weather had grounded everyone. In the command post, on the flight roster, you might have been listed as the backup. But on the ground, in that valley, when we heard your voice, you were the only one. That is a different thing entirely." His words pierced through her carefully constructed professional detachment. You were the only one. It was not about being the best pilot or the first choice. It was about being the person who answered the call when the void was the only other answer. He was giving her a gift, a perspective she could never have seen from 10,000 feet. He was telling her that her actions had not just been a successful military operation. They had been an act of profound, personal significance to the men who were there. "We thought it was over," Atlas said, his eyes holding hers. "We were taking stock of our ammunition, getting ready for the last stand. And then you came through the static. You were the cavalry. I will never forget that sound." He let go of her hand and stepped back, rejoining his team. The emotional intensity of the moment passed, replaced by a more relaxed, if still respectful, atmosphere. The other SEALs came forward, each one shaking her hand, murmuring their own quiet thanks before the team departed, leaving the common room as silently as they had entered. Anya stood there for a long time after they were gone, the lingering sensation of Atlas's handshake still palpable. She looked at her own hands, hands that knew the feel of a control stick and a throttle, hands that had flown through a storm and delivered fire with precision. For the first time, she truly understood that the consequences of their actions were not measured in destroyed targets or successful extractions, but in the quiet gratitude of the men who got to walk away and tell the story. Her story was now a part of theirs, forever intertwined. A week after the mission, a thick manila folder appeared on Anya's desk. It was unlabeled, save for a single, stark classification stamp: secret. She knew immediately what it was: the official after-action report for Operation Serpent's Tooth. This was the version of the story that would be entered into the archives, the sanitized, jargon-filled narrative that would follow her for the rest of her career. Her hands felt strangely cold as she opened it. The report was exactly what she expected: dry, clinical, and impersonal. It was a collection of charts, timelines, weather data, and ordnance expenditure logs. The dramatic, life-and-death struggle in the valley was reduced to a series of acronyms and technical assessments. Her desperate flight through the storm was logged as an unforecasted meteorological event. The chaotic firefight was a kinetic engagement with non-state actors. Even the Hind gunship was simply an enemy rotary wing asset. The language was designed to strip the events of their terrifying human reality. She read through the initial findings with a growing sense of apprehension. The report noted the flight line accident, the grounding of Major Jensen, and the severe weather warnings. It detailed her decision to take off, a choice that was flagged with an asterisk. The asterisk led to a footnote. Asterisk, deviation from standard operating procedure regarding flight operations in adverse weather conditions. Asterisk, there it was. The official black mark. A clinical phrase that could be interpreted as recklessness, a career-ending judgment. She felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. She had saved a dozen men, but the official record might only remember that she had broken the rules to do it. She kept reading, her eyes scanning the dense paragraphs of the mission summary. The report detailed her arrival on station, her coordination with Hammer 1, and the successful neutralization of multiple enemy positions. It was all factual, precise, and completely devoid of the terror and triumph of the actual moments. Then she reached the final section. Commander's Assessment, authored and signed by Colonel Miller himself. Her breath caught in her throat. This was the part that mattered most. Miller's words would frame the entire narrative. She began to read. Captain Petrova's decision to launch in defiance of a squadron-wide no-fly order was a significant command deviation, Miller had written. Anya's heart sank, but the next sentence changed everything. However, this deviation must be understood in the context of the extreme circumstances. With the primary pilot incapacitated and the ground team facing imminent annihilation, Captain Petrova's assessment of a high-risk, high-reward tactical opportunity was not an act of recklessness. It was a calculated act of courage, executed with a level of precision that mitigated the inherent dangers of the situation. He went on to validate her tactical reasoning, citing her early identification of the secondary threat on the southern ridge as a critical piece of intelligence that the primary mission plan had overlooked. He described her flight through the storm-channeled mountain pass not as a violation, but as an innovative solution to an otherwise unsolvable tactical problem. He was not just excusing her actions, he was championing them. He was using the cold, bureaucratic language of the report to build an unassailable defense of her judgment. The final paragraph of his assessment was the one that made her stop breathing altogether. The ultimate success of Operation Serpent's Tooth and the survival of all 12 members of SEAL Team Hammer 1 can be attributed to a single decisive factor. I defer to the official report filed by the Ground Force Commander, Sergeant Atlas, which concludes, the timely and exceptionally precise air support provided by call sign Nighthawk 2 was the sole reason our team was not overrun. Her presence in the sky, when no other support was available, was the decisive factor in the team's survival. Anya read the sentence again, then a third time. He had quoted Atlas directly. He had taken the raw, human truth of the men on the ground and embedded it into the heart of the sterile, official record. He had ensured that the story would not be about a pilot who broke the rules, but about the pilot who was the decisive factor. She closed the folder, her hands resting on its cover. The weight of it felt different now. It was no longer a potential indictment, but a validation. Glory had never been her goal. She had not flown into that storm seeking a medal or a commendation. She had simply sought to do her duty. But seeing the truth of that night captured in the black and white of an official report, protected and championed by her commanding officer, brought a profound sense of peace. Tucked into the last page of the file was a separate, smaller memo, It was a formal recommendation from Colonel Miller, nominating Captain Anya Petrova for the Distinguished Flying Cross for heroism in aerial combat. Anya looked at it for a moment, a flicker of pride warming her. But she knew, with an unshakable certainty, that the greatest reward had not come on a piece of official paper. It had come in a quiet voice over a crackling radio, in a shared moment of silence on the flight line, and in the respectful nod of a fellow pilot in a sterile infirmary. The official story was now written, but she would always carry the real one with her. A month later, the briefing room was unchanged. The same gray walls, the same tired air conditioner, the same scent of stale coffee. But for Anya, the entire geometry of the space had been altered. She was the one standing at the front of the room, her tablet connected to the projector, and the seat she had once occupied at the edge of the group was now filled by a young lieutenant, his eyes wide with a mixture of eagerness and apprehension. They were planning a routine armed reconnaissance mission, a far cry from the desperate scramble of Operation Serpent's Tooth. Anya walked the pilots through the ingress and egress routes, the potential threats, and the rules of engagement. Her style was different from Jensen's. It was less of a lecture and more of a conversation. She paused frequently, asking questions, inviting input. "Lieutenant," she said, turning to the young pilot, "the satellite imagery shows a narrow pass here. What are your thoughts on using it to mask our thermal signature on approach?" The lieutenant blinked, surprised to be addressed directly. He leaned forward, studying the map. "It's tight, ma'am." "Though turbulence could be a factor." "It could," Anya agreed. "But what does the terrain give us in return?" "Cover," the lieutenant said, his confidence growing. "Concealment. A direct protected line to the observation point." "Exactly," Anya said with a nod. "Risk versus reward. Always weigh it." She was not just giving him the plan, she was teaching him how to build one. She remembered Jensen's well-intentioned but stifling guidance in the simulator, and she made a conscious effort to do the opposite, to create space for the pilot beside her to think, to reason, to own a piece of the mission. When the briefing was over, the pilots filed out, but Anya remained for a moment, looking at the map projected on the screen. It was a landscape of possibilities, no longer just a grid of threats. She had learned that a shadow could be a threat, but it could also be an opportunity. A storm could be an obstacle, but it could also be a path. She walked out of the command building and into the bright, dry heat of the Afghan sun. Across the flight line, her A-10 was being armed and fueled. The ground crew had stenciled a new name beneath the cockpit canopy, just below her own: the Backup. It had started as a joke, but it had become a badge of honor, a squadron legend whispered with a smile. They had also painted a small, almost imperceptible silhouette of a helicopter on the fuselage, a quiet kill marking for a battle that would never appear in any official statistics. She looked at the plane, its rugged, unlovely form built for a singular, brutal purpose. It was not just a machine to her anymore. It was a partner. They had weathered the storm together, had faced the fire and flown home on fumes and faith. A part of her was forged into its very metal, just as a part of it now lived within her. Colonel Miller fell into step beside her as she walked toward the aircraft, his stride easy and familiar. They stood for a moment in silence, watching the activity on the flight line. "Major Jensen is being transferred stateside," Miller said conversationally. "He'll finish his recovery at Walter Reed. He sends his regards." "I'm glad to hear it," Anya said truthfully. "He recommended you to take over as flight commander," Miller added. said you had a knack for seeing things other people miss. He looked at her, a rare, small smile on his face. I agreed with his assessment. The words settled comfortably, without the jarring impact they once might have had. It felt natural, right? She was no longer fighting for a place at the table. She was simply taking her seat. Her journey had not been about replacing Jensen or proving anyone wrong. It had been about discovering that she was enough, just as she was. Her quiet diligence, her meticulous observation, her refusal to back down when it mattered. These were not weaknesses to be overcome, but the very source of her strength. She bid the colonel farewell and continued her walk toward the waiting plane. Her ground chief gave her a thumbs up as she approached. She climbed the ladder and settled into the familiar embrace of the cockpit, her hands moving over the controls with an intimacy born of shared crisis. As she prepared for takeoff, she looked out across the airfield. She saw the young lieutenant in his own jet, giving her a crisp nod. She saw the endless stretch of the runway, and beyond it, she saw the sky. It was a brilliant, cloudless blue, vast and open. It held no menace, no ghosts of the storm she had conquered. It was no longer a symbol of emptiness or a void to be filled. It was a promise, a space of infinite potential. She was Nighthawk 1 now. The sky was waiting, and it was not empty at all. It was full. 1 year later, the sky over the Kansas prairie was a vast, impossible canvas of orange and violet. The setting sun bled across the horizon, backlighting the skeletal frame of an old windmill turning slowly in the evening breeze. Below, at a small grass strip airfield, Anya Petrova leaned against the warm hood of a vintage pickup truck, a cold bottle of soda in her hand. She wore civilian clothes, worn jeans and a simple cotton shirt, and the flight suit felt like a skin she had shed a lifetime ago. In the hangar behind her, an old Stearman biplane, which she had spent the better part of the day flying, ticked and cooled in the fading light. There was no hum of electronics here, no scent of jet fuel, only the sweet smell of cut alfalfa and the distant lowing of cattle. Her fingers traced the edge of a worn, circular patch she kept in her jacket pocket. The embroidered A-10, the storm cloud, the bolt of lightning. It was not the distinguished flying cross, which now sat in a velvet box in a drawer somewhere. It was this small, unofficial token that held the true weight of her story. She had received a short, scrawled postcard a few months ago from a fishing village in Alaska. There was no signature, but she knew who had sent it. It just said, "The skies up here are never empty." Full of eagles, she smiled whenever she thought of it. Her eyes drifted upwards, to the first star pricking the deep purple of the twilight sky. She remembered the absolute blackness of that valley, the terrifying emptiness of a sky devoid of help. She remembered the voice that had cut through the static and the one that had answered back. They had called her a backup, a contingency, a spare part in the great machine. But in the moment that mattered, when the storm had swept away all the primary plans and the celebrated heroes, she had been the only one. Fame was a fleeting noise. Medals were markers for deeds already done. But the quiet knowledge of being there when the sky was empty, that was a different thing entirely. That was an honor that needed no witness, a silence that held more meaning than any applause. She took one last look at the immense, peaceful sky. It was full of stars, full of possibility, and it was waiting.